Hello, I'm Sarah Harper from the University of Oxford, and I'm delighted to be with you here this morning. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I have to fly to Tokyo today. But Mira thought that it would be very interesting for the group to learn a little bit about what we do at Oxford, and also about the work that we've done with the British government, both in their ageing review and more recently in developing the ageing challenge within the government's industrial strategy. So thank you very much, Mira, for the invitation. I very much enjoyed presenting last year, and I hope that ageing from cell to society is going to be of interest. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Oxford Institute at the University of Oxford, what we do. I'm going to talk about our concept of ageing and how it relates to both the cell and the society, and then I'm going to talk about the work that we've done with the British government. So the Oxford Institute of Ageing was established 20 years ago in 1998 with money from NIH. I had been working at the University of Chicago and was very impressed with the Centers on the Demography of Aging that the late Richard Sussman, who was a fantastic advocate for aging across the world, had set up across the States, and he gave me some money to found the first Centre on Population Aging here at Oxford. And we are a multidisciplinary centre, which, as I say, has been going for 20 years, with a variety of funders, both from government funders, private donations, all the way through to corporate and foundations. We run a series of programs. Life Course Family and Generations was the first one we started with. We then went on to work, retirement and pensions. Our next program looked at health and longevity, moving to population, environment and technology, and finally arts, humanities and design. But all these programs have been running, so the Life Course and Generations one has gone for 20 years, work, retirement and pensions for slightly shorter, etc. But it gives you an idea that we are truly multidisciplinary, and the people who work in the Institute predominantly have demography because we're about population aging and not just about individual aging. But colleagues are drawn from geography, anthropology, sociology, economics, psychology. We've had people with interest in health, nursing, ethics, so a complete spectrum. But we're basically a social science research institute interested in population aging. We very much have been influenced over the last decade or so by this new approach to aging. This is the old way we used to look at aging, and you can see that basically we all pottered through our lives until we got to about age 60, 65, and then if we became frail or disabled, geriatric medicine kicked in and kept us all alive with frailty and disability for as long as possible. That approach is no longer. The new approach is this: we push back as far as possible the onset of frailty and disability, and those of us working in biology, in public health, and in the behavioural sciences, and even in technology, have increasingly moved to that life course approach where we try to stop people going into frailty and disability for as long as possible, and then have a very short period of time where we can concentrate resources. And so from a sociological point of view, we tend to talk about active adulthood being from when you attain adulthood, typically in your late teens, going all the way through until that very short period at the end of your life, when you probably do go into what we traditionally think of as old age or very old age, when you do need probably resources from society to help you in that period. This is the way we tend to conceptualize, as I say, cell to society. We have the cell, which is basically what the biologists work in, the individual, typically the psychologist, society, those of us in social science, but we believe it also has a global aspect, and we talk very much about aging in an aging world. It's very different to grow old in a world that is itself demographically aging than to grow old in a world where most of the people are young. And we really believe that in order to understand this, we have to put that in the perspective of the life course and also in this age structural change of populations. So people who work on the cell, growth, maturity and death, people who work on the individual, looking at the relationship between the brain, the mind and the body, those of us working on society, community, culture and economy, but understanding that even things like geopolitics and migration if you look at it from an age structural point of view, are part of this big aging picture. I think it's very clear when we look in detail at the way that cell influences society and society influences the cell, that both biological and social factors are implicated in both damage and repair and interact closely. And I'm very grateful to the Centre for Healthy Aging in Copenhagen for introducing me to this slide. On the one side, you have stressors such as retirement, bereavement, or disease, which can manifest themselves during major life course events and transitions. And on the other side, you have resilience, enhancing factors such as exercise, social networks, and economic security, which can protect against the damage. And as I say, this is very much an approach that the Centre in Copenhagen are using. Other centres across the world are beginning to use this, and we in Oxford also think this is a very valuable framing for understanding the relationship between cell and society. So much so that we have been working with colleagues in something called YARU, the International Alliance of Research Universities. That's 11 top universities from across the world that are all working on aging to try and bring together everything from the biological aging, the psychological or individual aging, across to societal aging. And just to give you an idea of a project that we're putting together with colleagues in Copenhagen and also at the Aging Centre at ANU in Australia, looking at the cell-brain and work relationship, which unites the neuroscientists of Copenhagen who research brain aging with the psychologists at ANU exploring mental capacity change with age, and with the social scientists at my own institute in Oxford to understand the impact of the aging brain on the capacity of those in early old age or 50 to 70 to continue productively in the modern labour market. And we argue very strongly that these kind of big policy questions need to be addressed from a multidisciplinary perspective. Just to say that here in Oxford we also work very globally. Starting in 2005, we set up a network in Africa called AFRAN to encourage young researchers to be able to enter the field of demography and population aging. We then started EAST, which was to support our Eastern European colleagues, APRA, which is for Asia and links together many of the projects that occur throughout that region, and in fact is very much linked into the YARU university network that I earlier talked about, and LANA, where we have colleagues working in South America, because aging is truly global. It is not just a high-income challenge, it is also across the globe. But I want to move on now just to talk about the work that we did with the government. I was the chair of the government's Foresight Review on Aging between 2014 and 2016. I then worked with colleagues who were trying to get aging as one of the big industrial challenges for the UK, and indeed, along with AI and robotics, mobility, clean energy, aging is seen as one of the 4 big challenges that the UK will face across the next few decades. And then I worked with the Industrial Challenge Strategic Fund around healthy aging. Our Prime Minister has made an announcement that by 2035 she wants 5 years of healthy life added on to everybody, regardless of their background. In other words, to address the inequality question that we have in all societies. And so I have been working both with the Department of Health and with the Industrial Challenge Fund to encourage academics to think about how we can do research in this area, particularly research that includes people who work in technology and business, to really help that sector address healthy aging. But let's just look in a little bit more detail about the future of an aging population. So this was a 2.5-year project, or review, shall we say. 24 expert review papers were commissioned. We had meetings all over the UK. We did some international comparisons. And the general idea was that we would help the UK government understand how to make the UK population more resilient to the challenge of population aging. This is just a sort of outline on the project. You can see in the diagram, which has the project pillars on it, that we didn't just want to focus on health pensions, which was the traditional way of looking at it, but we actually wanted to look at both finance and employment. The workplace was very important, health and social care. We wanted to look at mental capacity throughout life, social cohesion, relationships, particularly family and kin relationships, but also relationships within different communities, within ethnic communities, within our wider place communities, and our whole environment and the infrastructure. And we felt that we had to take this multidisciplinary approach to help the UK government understand how to improve well-being, again, across the life course. Our argument is very much that in order to tackle ageing, it has to be an all-life course approach, education and work and health. The government was particularly interested in us thinking about 2025 and 2040, trying to understand what life would be like then and how we could prepare the UK for that. And as I say, a life course approach. And the aims were to develop an evidence base that the government could draw upon, to create new tools and methods to understand the ageing of our population, and to create models which would inform policy, and also to develop the capacity and the capability of the UK to be able to deal with the ageing of its population. I'm just going to pick up 4 of the key messages. There were many messages, but I'm just going to talk you through 4 of them. The ageing of the population will not occur in isolation. I think that's a really, really important message. There are so many challenges that are facing us all in the 21st century, and we tend to think that demographic change stands alone, and yet technological change, environmental change, social change are all running alongside. And I think it's really important that we understand that ageing is only one big challenge that we will be facing. So the key trend that we identified here was that social, cultural and economic factors will mediate these demographic trends, and these factors will change between generations. So we talked about things like how generations, how each generation ages affects what happens during their life course. We recognize that certain events and socioeconomic contexts would play out differently to different cohorts. And in particular, we saw that population ageing was in the context of an increasingly globalized and interconnected world. And we couldn't just think that the UK was in isolation and would age in isolation. And so some of the implications we looked at was that there was a real premium on integrating government across these time periods. In other words, the government needs a lifelong preparation, needs to recognize that a lifelong preparation is required for a later life, that there will be different policy needs for different cohorts coming through as they age. Governments need to address long-term pressures and not just react to short-term political cycles, and that responsibility and risk is actually changing between generations. We thought a lot about risk, so I want to just highlight another of the things that we reported on. One of the things we became very aware of is that risk factors accumulate across a lifetime, and that we're all born with particular advantages, and that leads us to be either resilient or not resilient to certain risks, but these risks do accumulate. And what is very clear is that inequalities become more pronounced as people and the population they live in ages. So for example, one of the things that's very clear is that your educational start in life, the kind of work opportunities you have, even where you live, the kind of housing you live in, the assets, etc. All of these will reflect upon your ability, for example, to finance your later life. So the main implication that came out of this section of the report was that inequalities have sectorial, temporal and spatial implications, and that there are thus multiple public budget implications across departments. And we really tried to push that this was not something that you would expect the Department of Health, or in our case, the Department of Work and Pensions to deal with, but all departments had to become involved. And I have to say that I think the UK government in 2015-16 responded very well to this call, and definitely the Department of Local Government, the Department of Transport, even DEFRA, which is our agricultural and rural areas, Departments of Environment, of Education, as well as Work, Pensions and Health, all responded to some of the findings that we were coming up with. We also did a very big piece around technology, because I think it's increasingly clear that technology will either facilitate inclusion or it can act as a source of exclusion. One of the things we particularly looked at was around IT and digital communication, and we argued that these were now essential public services, and it was really important that governments didn't allow the market to drive the kind of particularly digital communication or high technological mobility or high technological healthcare, that this was becoming as much a need as, for example, housing and fresh water and the right to food and education. These have all been accepted, but the new opportunities that the new technologies would bring should also be something that governments accepted were the same kind of right for well-being in the 21st century. So we did work around home and work, smart cares, transport systems, etc. We looked at things like wearables and health monitoring, biotech and health advances. So our real implication of this section was that technology is an agent of change for the well-being of all in an aging population. And then the fourth area that I just want to reflect upon is that we really felt that it was important that education and work opportunities across the life course were essential to well-being in later life. One of the really interesting things is around education and skills and training. I think we have long moved away from this idea that you are educated when you are young, and then maybe from your early 20s onwards you get no new educational skills training. The kind of world we live in, everybody has to upgrade their skills at a faster and faster rate. And as we begin to accept this, so we will not necessarily still have the problem that we have an older cohort that don't have the skills that are required, because there should be a real push that everybody across the life course upgrades their skills. Really big question about who is actually going to pay for this. Is it that the individual going forward should take responsibility for paying for their skills upgrading, or should it be employers, or should it be the government? But there was a general agreement from all the evidence we looked at that education and skills and training were going to be absolutely essential. We also thought there should be more education in public health to prepare for healthier lives, and education to thrive in this digital world. The real implication was that access to lifelong employment and education would facilitate inclusion or lead to exclusion. And that was a message that you saw in the slide before when we were talking about technology. But this idea that there are certain risks out there, we need to make our population more resilient, and how do we do it? Because otherwise some people will be included and some people will be excluded, was a really strong theme that ran through this review. So finally, just to conclude on the overarching themes, there are differences both between cohorts and within cohorts, and I think this intergenerational, intra-generational difference was something that came up very, very strongly. Within our generations, we know due to ethnicity or socioeconomic status, people have very, very different lifetime opportunities. But we also were beginning to recognize with the aging of the population, we were getting similar differences between the generations, within the generations, but also between the generations. We felt that there were different policy needs for different cohorts at different ages. A really big issue, as I said, is how governments can balance going forward the short-term needs of the current older with really planning for a population that is likely to live far longer than previous populations. That our aging population, from a policy point of view, really was one of those things where we did need integrated systems of policy, funding, service delivery, and importantly, regulation. And then finally, that spatial inequalities were very, very acute, even in the UK. And depending where you lived within the UK, you could have access to different types of employment, you could have access to different types of housing, you could have access to different types of education. And so different parts of the country were going to have different needs going forward. So that is a very quick overview of what we do at Oxford. Hopefully it has given you some of the ideas of how we do multidisciplinary research, and both within the university and, as I say, through the big YARU collaboration that we are involved with the 10 top universities which are selected from across the world, and then some idea of the kind of work that we as academics have been doing for the government in trying to help them devise a sort of holistic approach to population aging. So thank you very much for having me, almost having me with you, and I hope the rest of your day goes well. Thank you.